David, welcome to the new decade, 2020. How are you?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you. And I'm saying, first of all, Happy New Year to everyone. And let's hope we help the public at large establish a 2020 vision of what's coming down the track. Over to you.
Yeah. You and I have a number of things in store for our viewers coming up in 2020. I don't know that we want to tip our hat just yet as to exactly what those are. I wanted to ask you briefly, David. I know a lot of people have been following you on Twitter at CSI Hawkins and getting onto your Patreon page at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, but people have also come to rely on looking at your posts and the various information that you've posted on your free website, reversecsiscripts.com. When I went to load it up for our show, it was down. Do you have any information about this? You want to tell us anything about this?
Yeah, I've talked to my web host, who is a very competent person. He helped me design what you've been kind enough to say looks very good. And he said that the server system for a number of his clients had gone down, and he's working on them getting back up as fast as he can. It came back briefly, and as you know, I'm pretty technophobic, so I'm relying on him over the next few days to get it back up. But I'm praying and hoping it's not something sinister. Over to you.
Right. But it's interesting that it's suspended and not accessible to people. So that's something. And we're going to be talking a lot. You and I have been in communication over the holidays and everything. And is this our first show back since a very coursey Christmas? I can't recall.
Yes, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. We did one more. We did one from my remote location there. But that was a great show. Thank you for participating in that. You and I have been talking quite a bit and preparing what we're going to be talking about. You've sort of refocused some of your attention on George Orwell and his predictions of 1984. I think I had forgotten that George Orwell was himself a BBC broadcaster. What do we want to say about George Orwell?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating because he apparently was forced to sit through interminable, tortuous sessions in room 101 in Broadcasting House. And so he transferred the words room 101 to this mythical, except that I believe now it's rapidly coming true, organization which allows you to brainwash and change and get people to betray each other. Because what's done in the fiction, of course, is to establish what form of paranoia takes in an individual, and everyone has their own. Apparently, in the character of the novel, Winston was paranoid about rats from childhood. So in order to get Winston to betray whether she was his lover or whatever, they were in a romantic entanglement, which was frowned upon by Big Brother. So in order to get Winston to betray his partner, Julia, they threatened and actually clipped on a cage to his face with two large rats, where if the grid was lifted, the rats would start eating Winston's face. And this caused, of course, horrendous panic and mental stress for Winston. So he was encouraged to say, all right, don't do it to me, do it to Julia, right? Apparently Julia got the similar treatment. Now, we don't know exactly from the novel what she was paranoid about, but subsequently, towards the end of the novel, they met on a park bench and had a rather stilted conversation, and they both confessed to each other that they had betrayed each other, right? And then I think Julia got up and she said, well, I've got to get my tube. So they parted. So a rather sad, soggy, sorry encounter that was briefly romantic and then, under the auspices of Big Brother, turned into a mutual dislike and betrayal. And I think you and I can probably relate to a number of people who've come into our ambit, if you will, over years past, who seem to have drifted away, or whether actively betrayed us is the right description. But I sense that Big Brother, and you've got a facade there of Broadcasting House that if you zoom in, you might be able to make it up. But apparently room 101 was actually in that building at the center of your picture there, room 101. That was where George Orwell sat, I think his name was Eric Blair. Oh, wonderful, wonderful images. Yes, excellent. And of course, so Broadcasting House was built, I think, in the 20s. And there is this, what I would describe as shameful sculpture outside by an Eric Gill, who had sexual relations with the family dog and his two daughters and his wife. And he carved this sculpture, which, as you can see, is a bearded man holding, embracing, I don't know if that's the right word, a naked boy who's holding, I think it's a lute in his hand. So they're standing on the globe. And what I would suggest, who is an expert on symbols, no, I don't say I'm an expert on symbols, but everyone probably has an opinion of symbols, the swastika and so on. So these two figures are standing on the globe. Now, I would interpret that is that there is an internal pedophile, male pedophile elite inside the BBC, maybe starting back in the 1920s, but extending through, reign is perhaps the wrong word, Jimmy Savile, through the present, where a number of people within the BBC have been entrapped in a pedophile encounter and filmed and are absolutely being extorted through a sort of Room 101 arrangement into betraying their families and their colleagues and their fellow countrymen right through to the present. Over to you.
David, look at what they've got right at the top of this very bizarre, whatever you'd call it, this building, this art installation. Yeah, they got a clock right there.
Well, a clock is one of the ways I think you and I can help our audience interpret the use of patented devices for the custodians of Room 101 at various crime scenes. And let me give you a classic example of a crime scene. 911 in New York was a crime scene, right? They attributed it to various terrorist groups. But you have this extraordinary story of Jane Stanley at the BBC in New York, reading from her teleprompter, I suppose George Orwell would call it a telescreen, a prompted text, which she reads out as something to the effect, "We're getting news that the Salomon Brothers building has collapsed." Unfortunately for the BBC, and I'm going to come to a couple of invitations that I would like to make on this show, the image of Jane Stanley reading from the teleprompter is perhaps overshadowed, if that's the right word, by the image of Building 7, the Salomon Brothers building, still standing over her left shoulder. And what that tells me is that the spoken text display apparatus for generating TV signals, which was applied for in a patent application by the BBC on the 3rd of August 1998, was being used as a kind of Room 101 teleprompter combined with signals to the demolition crew to blow the building up. And the building didn't collapse. It was demolished in an explosion. But of course, had the public known at large that the building number 7, which was never hit by a plane, was demolished by an explosion, or more probably using incendiary devices, then they would have understood this wasn't an attack by some clown in a cave in Afghanistan straddling a yak, but it was actually an internal attack on the United States by the custodians of what I now call the Room 101 television patents. Over to you.
It's very strange language in the title of this patent, David. Spoken text, display method and apparatus for use in generating television signals. I mean, it looks very much like an automated teleprompter. I think if I had invented this, I would name it an automated teleprompter that responds to spoken text. See, because normally with a teleprompter, there's someone operating it who's listening to the person who's speaking and advancing the slide as they read through it so that they're reading the next bit of text. But as I understand this, it uses speech recognition to control the speed at which the text scrolls to make sure that the person is reading it. And it introduces all kinds of opportunities to, if artificial intelligence gets involved, perhaps even change the text presented to the presenter if they're saying something that they don't like. I also found it interesting in this figure 1 image, they chose, you didn't really need to write this here. it says the incident was seen. What do you think about that, David? It's not really part of the patent, but it's just a bit of text within the patent drawing.
Yeah, to give you an example, so basically what I would suggest this invention allows them to do is to prompt Jane Stanley into saying the building has collapsed, as opposed to the building was blown up. And you're absolutely right. That's what struck me as very weird, the generation of TV signals. That is to say, there seem to be two functions from the point of view of a room 101. One is to feed text that is moving at the rate that Jane Stanley is speaking. So if she speeds up, the text speeds up using voice or text recognition. But interestingly, in the body of the patent, it talks about there is no need to have a big vocabulary, right? Because the utterance of Jane Stanley is going to use a few words. So they don't have to search for a lot of words from the matching point of view, but that is pure double speak, unthinking, because Big Brother wants to reduce the vocabulary available to people so they can't describe or even recognize a crime. So the word collapse is neutral. The word demolish is not neutral. Big Brother, Room 101, the custodians do not want a language that the proletariat, and that's the word of the 1984, would recognize that they're actually looking not at a terrorist attack, they're looking at a crime scene. Right? So it's extraordinary. You've got that combination of what I would call digital blocking notes that are sent to the actors that are deployed at the crime scene, for example, to clean it up, or to blow up the building. And what's absolutely amazing about building number 7, or the Salomon Brothers building, I mean, there are many, many amazing things that would, I think we can help people unravel the conspiracy, which is that the people working on the upgrade of the diesel systems in building number 7, the Salomon Brothers building, was AMEC, right? And AMEC are the people who are in the floors above Starnet Communications in Vancouver. Now, Starnet Communications, I believe, and I think we can explore that, is very probably the outsourced equivalent of Room 101, where people can be tortured, right, into betraying their colleagues and friends. So as we know, Starnet Communication was raided on the 20th of August 1999. You came up, we made, I think, a very interesting documentary for people, except that they would have needed to watch it very carefully to pick up some of the clues and some of the symbols. But I think you're about to zero in on that building, which has a mural on it, which has got the star and a raven. And a gentleman on the sidewalk told us that that was a warning. And that's very close to Starnet Communications. And the way I read it is the people in the downtown east side are being warned by Big Brother or the custodians of Room 101, which might be SERCO or the BBC. Do not talk about what your eyes you see and what your ears are hearing, because
David,
we want the story. Go ahead.
Look at that. When you go down to the street level view, we're seeing a Google photograph with the building not having that painting on it. See that?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Let's see if we
Now,
can back
is that
up.
being scrubbed, or
I don't know.
what's happening there?
I don't know. Maybe if we back up. Sometimes Google has photographs from different times stitched together. That's very interesting. It's not there.
It is. Now this is extremely interesting because let me just read, because my memory is going a little bit. The 3 sacred principles of INGSOC are newspeak, doublethink, and you're going to like this, the mutability of the past. Where have we seen some past being mutated?
Yeah.
Mendenhall's baby?
Yes.
Right. You mentioned in an earlier conversation today about how Amazon had, I think, what was the context of what you were saying?
Well, I
Something
don't
about
want to
mutated
reveal
device?
exactly, but I was speaking with someone who told me that Amazon artificial intelligence was used, it was forced on them. It has to do with payments through Patreon, and that the banks require them to use this artificial intelligence from Amazon.com.
Okay, can I make a couple of challenges to two people?
Sure.
That can go out on the air. One is the Baron Sainsbury, who's the Chancellor of my alma mater, Cambridge. And the other one is Greg Dyke, a friend of mine from my Twickenham days, who was the Director General of the BBC between 2000 and 2004. So let me start with a challenge to Baron Sainsbury. And I'll give you a quote from Baron Sainsbury that is relevant to the 9/11 attack. And he said, "If you know your life chances are greatly reduced, should you be in a position to take out life insurance if that knowledge is not available to the insurers?" Now that to me is very relevant in the case of the shareholders of SERCO, including major insurance companies, that met on the 47th floor of building number 1 on the morning of 9/11. And let me be hypothetical here. Let's assume that this was a Room 101 play, and the people who showed up at that meeting, and I believe it was in the offices of Adjusters International, were told, you've got a choice here, because there is a weapons platform, forget what it is, a weapons platform heading your way, right? So they're in, let's say around 8:30, they're in this meeting on the 47th floor. Chris Hyman has come down from the windows of the world, and they're invited to select which floor the weapons platform is going to hit, right? And they say, well, we could put it into the 88th floor, but wherever it goes, no one is going to survive above the point of impact. So would you prefer it to be hitting on the 47th floor or the 88th floor? So I imagine if you believe that this is going to happen, and you're a shareholder of SERCO in the Adjusters International office, you're going to say, let's hit the 87th floor because we don't want to be killed.
Right.
Isn't that almost like Winston having the rats potentially on his face? I'm not sure they ever opened the cage doors so that he was started to be eaten, but he, under those circumstances, betrayed his lover or the woman he was in a relationship with. So I'm starting to think, is it possible? I mean, it's evil beyond belief, but maybe it's like J. Edgar Hoover said, the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous they cannot believe it. Because maybe there were good people, obviously the great majority were good people in New York that morning, good firefighters, good members of the New York Police Department, etc., and they were given a choice between their personal survival and betraying their colleagues. And what I'm saying to Baron Sainsbury and my friend Greg Dyke is, there is a wealth of evidence, and you can find more and more of it by coming to your show, Jason, where you have me on, as we go through what I believe might be a 2020 vision to expose a conspiracy where they used Room 101 and they deployed it as a weapon using modern technology and patented devices to get people in New York and Washington, for that matter, to betray each other out of terror. I think if I had the threat, and I'm not particularly paranoid about rats, but if Winston was paranoid about rats, to have the threat, yeah, biting and eating your eyeballs and that sort of thing. I mean, how do we know we wouldn't betray the people we most love? You're taken into a zone where the mind can barely function at all. I mean, the guy is paralyzed with fear. So I would say to Baron Sainsbury, you made this point about insurance. Well, the people who met on the 47th floor with SERCO, none of whom have been interviewed by the FBI, and there was about 100 shareholders, some global custodians, but two very important people were represented, as one of the university's superannuation scheme, and the other the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association. Maybe they had some skin in the game from the point of view of an insurance fraud. Right? So I've identified, as I've discussed with you, maybe we talked about it in the last show, There's the Center for Research into the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, acronym CRASH, not very original, right? Founded in 2001, that I believe would have the intellectual ability to write a script for the 9/11 attack in New York, because today, and I'd like to know when that research started, they've been asked and are working on the development of artificial intelligence to detect hate speech. And I'm warning, it's not a threat, I'm just warning, because of my 40 years or so background in AI, Baron Sainsbury, the Chancellor of Cambridge University, my alma mater, if you are encouraging or supporting the development of artificial intelligence algorithms to detect hate speech, then you are encouraging the development of artificial intelligence to inject hate speech, in which case you would be a party to the kind of crimes associated with a modern Room 101 that I believe was refined at Starnet Communications in Vancouver before the police raid. And when they took away all that kit, including the images of child abuse, I believe they opened up the operation in building number 6, the Customs, United States Customs Service in New York, where a plan view of it shows that it was blown up sometime during 9/11. And I'd like to know who blew it up, because there's a lot of evidence there of an international elite criminal organization engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography and sportsbook gaming in, I would say by now, 100 countries, with potentially 10 million blackmail victims who went, yeah, it's interesting, it's still gone, isn't it?
Well, that's, yeah, from the photographic, sorry to distract you with that, Dave. I was just getting it ready for our next image of it. But it's, yeah, I mean, the way I don't mean to cut off your last statement there, but the way I understand how this works is that they use a multitude of satellite images to create these 3D images. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is what it looks like, or at least it did in September or August, whenever it was that I came to visit you. And then, you know, when we get down to the street level view with this, where we're dealing with photographic image rather than a photogrammetry image, it doesn't have it there. It looks like this area is under construction. But sorry, David, you were talking about this Center for Research. What was the rest of the acronym there? I'm looking for that thing.
Center for Research into the Arts, the Social Sciences and Humanities. And if you read the blurb, it's this pure gobbledygook, right? Where they talk about, for example, hate speech and intercepting it. And I think we need to take a close look at CRASH. What worries me is, first of all, the stupidity of the acronym, because I think these people are so prideful, right? They think we're all too dumb to recognize. But to call an outfit CRASH and found it in 2001 and have the potential of detecting hate speech or injecting hate speech, because with my background in AI, if you have an algorithm that detects hate speech, first of all, it really means that a legitimate investigator into hate speech cannot use the words of hate speech, because the artificial intelligence algorithm will pick it up and treat it as hate speech. And we looked at this outfit called Cyvalence, which just before the show, but Cyvalence has the 6th patent of Room 101, which is the ability to operate a social engineering protection appliance, where semantic and non-semantic information floats around on the internet, and the system picks that up and decides what is malicious. And I'm saying, how can you possibly have a machine deem a body of work, maybe by a legitimate researcher or an illegitimate researcher, is to be treated as malicious and compartmentalized? Because I sense that this technology is being used to compartmentalize people like you and me and neutralize us, when in fact the work that we should be doing, we should be in front of the broader public, and we should be helping the public understand 2020 vision, if you will, how these perceptions could be manipulated. So we're chasing, from a societal point of view, fake enemies. Over to you.
You know, it's interesting, David, when we look at this CRASH thing, I don't know if you noticed right there, but when I went under people, I always like to see who's involved with these things. It's strange to me that the first two people listed, one of them is Anne Alexander, and the other is Anna Alexandrova. That's bizarre.
Well, it's bizarre also because if you look at the names there, and again, I hope I'm not being, a heterosexual, bipedal white man. There's a lot of names there that I wouldn't necessarily relate to, the history of Cambridge, and I don't want to make any particular point there, except that this organization describes itself as an interdisciplinary system. But I look at that and I don't see any attempt in that organization to do what I call ground truthing. As an engineer, and we've discussed that before, if you're ground truthing a theory, let's say in the 1980s I was ground truthing theories of interpretation in an oil field, where you take the data from the oil field and you compare it with the synthetic data generated by the computer. If there's a mismatch, the interpreter, might be a petrophysicist or a geologist, said that is not a true description of what the real formation is. You come to a crime scene and you don't ground truth your theory of the crime, you end up with a situation like Jane Stanley says, the building has collapsed and it's still standing. So what they're not doing at Cambridge, and I have an issue with it, and I want to draw a line in the sand to Baron Sainsbury, I want to do everything in my power to bring ground truthing into Cambridge University, because at the moment, Baron Sainsbury, you are leaving it out, and in particular, you're leaving it out with this research being done by Crash into the use of artificial intelligence to detect hate speech. And what you're hiding, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, is the ability to ground truth hate speech and determine whether it's coming from a source that's trying to recognize the fraud behind the speech. Where we might be told, for example, that the United States Embassy in Iraq has been invaded by Hezbollah, when in fact that might be invaded by a renter crowd to create the perception that Donald Trump has got to take action against the bad guys in Iraq. Over to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, that whole situation in Iraq. And I mean, it was basically suppressed pretty quickly. There was another interesting story that we had, David, that connects to Cambridge with regard to what you've just raised. Now, wasn't Stephen Halper somehow associated with Cambridge? That guy, you know who I'm talking about?
The Cambridge Analytica guy?
I guess that's what it was.
Was that the feeding of the bogus data and affecting through Facebook, et cetera,
Well, I don't know. He was basically here. So Stephen Halper, as I understand it, is a Cambridge professor or something. Let's read about him for a second. We've got a lot of things here on tap that I want us to look at. But Stephen Halper, he's, fellow at the University of Cambridge and a life fellow at Magdalene College. What do we know about
Magdalene,
that?
you pronounce that. Yeah, Magdalene College. It's one of the colleges at Cambridge.
Okay. So what's the story with that?
Well, if I haven't, I'm not sure. Is this the Cambridge Analytica guy who developed a polling?
I think he was a spy within the Trump campaign. And the reason that I bring him up is that, we were talking on More Pain, the show with Michael Moore, about how, it even says it right here in Wikipedia. Stephen Halper is an American foreign policy scholar and a senior fellow at the University of Cambridge, where he's a life fellow at the, however you pronounce that, Magdalene College. Served as a White House official in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. Now that's interesting because Richard Nixon and what happened to him with Watergate, I think history will show, is more similar to what's going on with Donald Trump's impeachment than we might have previously realized. Ford was obviously a dope, basically installed by Nixon or maybe the CIA. He was a member of the Warren Commission. And notice who's missing from here is Jimmy Carter. And we have learned from reporting from True Pundit and Mike Moore that Stephen Halper was involved in spying on the Carter administration. And we also know that George H.W. Bush was the director of the CIA at that time, and that the whole business with the Iranian hostage situation at the U.S. Embassy in Iran was the linchpin in getting Jimmy Carter not reelected in favor of Ronald Reagan, who was basically immediately subjected to an assassination attempt, which would have made George H.W. Bush president, but that failed, and then Bush became president later. So what I'm getting at, David, is that it seems to me that this attack at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq was basically running the same playbook again. They had a bunch of militants storm the embassy, and the fake news injection is that, oh, the people of Iraq are rowdy and they don't like the U.S., and Trump's foreign policy is a problem, so they're going to attack the embassy. And then undoubtedly in the election here in the United States, Democrats and opponents of Donald Trump would raise this as a failure. I mean, I'm sure they wanted lots of people to be killed, taken hostage like they were last time. It just seems like people like this guy, Stephen Halper, get inserted into these campaigns, their operational plants, so that the CIA or this supranational intelligence arrangement can manipulate things, and we, the members of the public, we, the people, are deflected by fake news to make us think that something's happening, which is totally not what's actually happening.
And that's 1984, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
Basically, so George Orwell, he writes the book in 1949. It relates to 1984, but in the context of 1949, so 39 to 45, 4 years after the war, you have a Cambridge spy ring. There's about 5 of them that is embedded inside the establishment, if you will. And there's some really sick characters, because one of them, Anthony Blunt and Guy Burgess, would be using Victor Rothschild's apartment in London to hold homosexual pedophile orgies, apparently, that ended in a not very pleasant way for an adolescent boy, as I understand it, and we can check and cross-check, etc., is that Anthony Blunt would be sodomizing the boy while he's being strangled, while in turn Anthony Blunt is being sodomized by a guy called Socks on Rothschild, because he would keep his socks on. Now, this is pretty sick, but you see, what I'm getting at is there a culture inside the BBC of homosexual pedophilia where you have an elite group of people who've been photographed doing disgusting things to children, right, who can then be blackmailed through a sort of Room 101 into betraying their friends, their country, and their family? And I would suggest that we're probably going to be able to analyze some of the great attacks attributed to external forces in the context of this clown, you know, Jimmy Savile, who spent about 40 or 50 years within the BBC, apparently functioning in the same way as Ghislaine Maxwell functioned with Jeffrey Epstein, as a pedophile pimp, setting up encounters between the people who would be interviewed by the BBC or visit Broadcasting House, setting up children for them to be abused, but the most important thing, collecting the imagery that could subsequently be used to blackmail people in a sort of Room 101 racket. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was sort of hinting at, is that it seems like they haven't actually changed their approach at all. They've just put in new players. And this makes a ton of sense, David. Whatever it is that anybody is doing, I mean, BBC, they're creating broadcasts, right? I mean, if you went back to 1960 and looked at how a television show or a movie or a documentary were produced, I mean, sure, you've got different technologies now. They're going to be using digital cameras instead of film cameras, more sophisticated equipment, updates to the lighting technology, but it's essentially the same. You've got a director, you've got actors, you've got a sound technician, you've got a camera operator, you've got a director of photography, you've got an electrician who looks after the lights. All of those positions are the same, but certainly whoever was doing it in 1960 is not doing it in 2020 because they're old or dead or retired or whatever. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Is Jimmy Savile replaced by Jeffrey Epstein? Is Halper still active in his position of being an operational plant in the U.S. government to carry out the desires of this supranational fraternity? I mean, you know, you've spoken to us about how, what's the fat guy's name who's the Mendenhauer? Grandson of Churchill?
Oh, Winston Churchill?
The grandson.
You mean...
The guy who Mendenhauer...
Soames, yeah.
Nicholas Soames. So Nicholas Soames was working for Mark Hatfield, the U.S. Senator. Why? Why is a guy who's, you know, until Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, Nicholas Soames was a member of Parliament in England. Why wasn't he interning in the 1970s for some member of Parliament in England? What was he doing in the United States working for a senator who oversees the procurement committee or whatever the Senate committee that guy was on? It's weird.
Well, and it's sinister. And if you look at the role that subsequently Nicholas Soames played, I mean, he was Minister for Armed Forces in the Tony Blair government, Tony Blair being a Fabian and an Oxford graduate, and that's maybe relevant or irrelevant. But from 1994 to 1997, Nicholas Soames was the Minister for the Armed Forces in the government of John Major. Now, that was the period when, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, SERCO was training the air traffic controllers.
And his brother is the chairman of SERCO, isn't he, or the CEO?
Absolutely, yes, Rupert Soames. And so Nicholas Soames and Rupert Soames are brothers. What's very interesting with the 7/7 underground bombing, which replicated all of the simulated times of the explosions and the simulated places. So someone substituted real explosives for the whiz-bang type explosives during the exercise. There was a contract with what's called the Resilience Mortuary, where it was set up in the grounds of the Honourable Artillery Company, which goes back to, I think, the 15th century. And it's a very elaborate mortuary, right, to process the bodies and body parts coming out of the 7/7 attacks in the London Underground and the bus that was blown up. And what's interesting is the power supply for that resilience mortuary was provided by Agrico, and Agrico at that time, the chief executive officer was Rupert Soames.
Wow.
And apparently during the analysis, the coroner was amazed because there were no autopsies done on how those people died. And I believe had the autopsies been done, they would have found that there were military explosives underneath the floor of the carriages because the floors of the carriages were blown upwards. So this was another classic example of a Room 101, I believe, attack where the public is being unwitnessed. You know, I've coined that phrase from sort of newspeak, where you basically have been told to reject what your eyes saw and what your ears heard, and come in behind the theory of the crime that is being propagated by the custodians of Room 101. And what we're being driven away from is identifying who those custodians are. And I think you and I, over the next early part of 2020, we can explain who the custodians of Room 101 are. And essentially, they are the custodians of the patterns required to shape public perceptions and mislead the public that are based on those 6 patterns I've identified, including the spoken text display apparatus for generating TV signals. And like you, I find that very odd wording, to generate TV signals, as though the spoken part was less relevant than the digital blocking notes being sent to the demolition crew and the cleanup crew to remove evidence and shape people's public attention, public perception of what really happened. Over to you.
Yeah. I find it particularly odd because, even in the description of, let's say, a video camera, it doesn't seem like you'd describe it as an apparatus for generating television signals, although that is a much more accurate description of what a video camera can and does do. This thing is an apparatus for telling somebody what to say. And I mean, I guess
You've got it.
Yeah.
Those are, I believe, digital blocking notes where the newsreader merely slavishly, what else can she do, reads the text of what she's being told to say, right? This is a teleprompter or back to George Orwell. So she reads that in good faith. I'm not blaming Jane Stanley. Oh, but let me come back to the challenge that I want to put to Greg Dyke. So Greg Dyke is a friend of mine. Mm-hmm. He was the Director General of the BBC between 2000 and 2004. So the buck stops there. So whatever Jane Stanley did or didn't do, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, Greg Dyke, my friend, should have an explanation. So I challenged him, through my post, and he can respond as he wishes, to give you a call, Jason. He may or may not. That's up to him. And appear on the show where we could discuss, is it possible that Room 101 in Broadcasting House could have become an outsourced opportunity for the people who have custody of these patented devices to stage attacks like the 7/7 underground bombing or the Manchester bombing or even the murder of the women and children at 425 Carroll Street, and shape public perceptions so that the public is going one way and the truth is going the other way. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, David, we're just about out of time here on our YouTube portion of the broadcast. For people who are just joining us, maybe haven't seen the show before, every week, you and I, David, we're doing a sponsor-exclusive show on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to get you onto Subscribestar, David, because that way we can sort of have some diverse platforms. I'm very concerned about this artificial intelligence from Amazon.com that the banks require these payment services to use. I wonder, this artificial intelligence that can choose to suspend accounts or unwitness people. I mean, you've said many times artificial intelligence that's allowed to go rogue. I mean, there's a number of experts who have weighed in on this matter, including Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator. We don't want artificial intelligence to destroy mankind. Perhaps it's starting with your website. But Patreon and Subscribestar are the places to go to view the sponsor-exclusive content. And David, I want to remind people that this is a system that I've created so that co-hosts like yourself can enjoy the benefit of individual sponsorship from viewers without me having to create a staff and pay people, and then I would be accused by social engineers of paying you for what you say or whatever it is. This is a way to create sort of a decentralized corporation where I don't have to worry about employees. People who appear on the show are free to say whatever they want to say, and the audience becomes the sponsors. We are very interested in this micro sponsorship idea where no individual sponsor is subject to any acute financial burden, and at the same time, no one can have the opportunity to have an undue financial influence on the reporting in the way that corporate sponsored news broadcasts could be subjected to. So I hope that people will join us just about 15 minutes from now on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Thank you, David, for another excellent broadcast. I look forward to seeing everyone there, and we'll be beginning just 15 minutes. So thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.